Hello everyone, my name's Caitlin Clark. I am a second year undergraduate student at the University of Oxford studying French and history. And I'm currently taking part in a micro-internship with GenZs, working to shine a light on refugee stories and post-conflict communities. Initially, I was immediately drawn to the project as someone who'd previously covered modern conflict like the situation in Gaza for student news. And these previous articles had been quite factual, very abrupt, and focused on chronological events alone. So I was quite keen to take on an opportunity to explore another community recovering from the catastrophic toll of war. I think that this is really important work. Mainstream news coverage often focuses on the events of war alone, so the figures, the death toll, but it really fails to consider the lingering effects of conflict on a community, which can be devastating in their own right. And I think that what's so great about this programme is that it allows us to look at post-conflict communities through a more humanist lens. We can see people as more than just a number on a page. Because conflict and war can have such long-lasting negative effects on people, on nations. And so this approach, it really helps us to consider the possible reasons for ongoing inequality, poverty, perhaps the lack of education in countries that are recovering from conflict. So for part of this internship, I was tasked with writing an article on any post-conflict community of my choice, and relating their struggle to the 7 fundamental human needs. So these are things like safety and security, identity, participation, and understanding. I chose to conduct my research on Algeria, which is a nation still to this day recovering from the lingering consequences of its war for independence in the 1950s and 1960s. And why I wanted to look at Algeria, I'm an undergraduate studying French, so I really wanted to use the opportunity to explore a nation which has such deep historical links to mainland France. And Algeria's relationship with its former coloniser is very complex and very intricate. I remember in school being taught a little bit about the relationship between France and Algeria, but what students are typically taught is that the relationship between France and Algeria is complex, but we mainly look at it through the lens of Algerians who have migrated to France after the War for Independence. So I think that Algerians who remained in their homeland have often been neglected by a lot of work done on Algeria in general. These people had such a mammoth task of rebuilding their nation post-war, post-conflict, and now they had to do it without any existing infrastructure that had been brought in by this French colonising nation. So one of my other major motivations for researching Algeria post-conflict was a desire to explore how Algerian identity itself had been formed. So as a languages student, I find it incredibly interesting to see how language in particular can influence the collective identity of a nation and individual identities. And what I found so interesting about Algeria in my research was that in its quest for becoming separate from the French language and culture, it adopted a policy of Arabization post-conflict, which really had a negative effect on some smaller communities like Berber communities, and also groups like women who weren't being represented by the existing social structure. So women didn't have much autonomy, didn't have the recognition of their participation in the fight for freedom in the War for Independence. I think that Algeria is a great example of how post-conflict communities must struggle through decades of injustice and social inequality before they see change. Particularly when we look at women and women's access to education, it's only been very, very recently that you can see women are now overtaking men in the figures for going to school, going to university in Algeria. And education reforms in particular, I noticed, have been very, very slow. And even in the period of the 1970s, the 1980s, post-conflict, many Algerians had to survive without essentials like access to healthcare and basic food stuff, purely because there was no infrastructure to support them after the French withdrawal from Algeria. This task was also a great opportunity for me to consider the psychological effects of conflict on communities and individuals alike. I think the Algerian War of Independence is such a great example of mental scars being so significant post-conflict. During the war, 2 million Algerians had been placed in concentration camps by French forces, and such a vast displacement of individuals, it was bound to leave some kind of mental scars. And I think that only recently we have really focused on the mental effects of war, because mental health has been such a taboo subject in the wider world for so long. So it's easy to see why post-conflict struggles have been neglected, perhaps by the narrative of the media, because really people haven't been focusing on things like PTSD. They weren't considered real issues until very recently. They were kind of written off as not important, not significant problems at all. I think overall, what I've taken away from writing this article is it's provided a great insight into a community who is still picking up the pieces from a conflict that ended over 60 years ago now. And whilst we often focus on astronomical death tolls and the bloodshed in war, in conflict, and this is, of course, very sad, a very important issue, but it's equally important that we consider the mental toll on a community who have to come to terms with such devastation and who have to take the time to rebuild. Because in the case of Algeria, this social infrastructure wasn't there to support the people, and it wasn't there to support the people for a very long time. And I think that's really shown with conflicts that they've had since the end of the War for Independence. So they've had a civil war since, and very, very recently, in the last 5 years, there have been protests by Algerians who are still seeking social justice and recognition of their fundamental human needs. So I think that we really have to consider the mental toll that war and conflict can have on people. And until very recently, I don't think this has been an issue that people have been covering, that people have been considering. And I think that this internship was a great way to look at war and conflict in a different way, through a different lens. Because, like I've said, everything is very much focused on the fact of war and the events, and not the people who it affects, because these people have to rebuild, they have to spend decades living in poverty before they even have access to basic needs like education. And I think that's really, really tragic. So I just want to say, please read the article if this is something that you would like to learn more about. I know that it was really interesting for me to look at a nation who perhaps aren't someone who particularly, they don't come to mind for a lot of people when you think about post-conflict communities. I think that they've been swept under the rug a little bit, but hopefully this has helped to shed a light on Algeria's struggles over the last 60 so years to rebuild after such a devastating war. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this has been an interesting idea for people to consider.